Volume 3 Chapter 41. Damn it! Zariasu and Shaziryu cursed in a moment of horror, and charged at once when the lizardmen looked behind them to see if their leaders were truly full of fear, only to see the opposite. The effect of Hiketi's victory was short-lived. Seeing two more chiefs charge at the point of conflict returned spirit to the lizardmen, who made space enough for the brothers to charge up the path of the dead to face the queen of the frogmen. But then, quite to the shock of the lizardmen down below, they did the unthinkable. They jumped inside the wall, avoiding the queen entirely, and causing an uproar among their own ranks. "Will you let your chiefs take the city alone?" Zariasu roared in the moment of mutual horror from both sides as he and his brother resumed the battle as if they had breached the wall by themselves and had an army inside with them already. The lizardmen of both tribes rushed forward after the pair, and Hiketi came to her senses. She turned from the wall and leapt into the interior of the frogman settlement, and staring down the two brothers from her towering height she snapped her spear in front of herself again. It dripped with Kyukuzuzu's blood still. 1 or 2 or 10 of you animals, and I will win still. She let out a harsh and rough ribbit, and Shaziryu looked up at the monster of a frog woman. He found it hard to argue. The fighting grew more vicious as the eldest of the frogmen tried to stem the lizardman tide, and strength began to fail the frogmen at long last. A ruined section of wall that was nothing but vines that had not yet had wood added to it, gave way when the defenders died and the lizardmen cut their way inside. The magic casters at the back unleashed the last spell volley in their arsenals, a string of well-timed magic arrows that struck a series of lizardmen in rapid succession, sending them tumbling backwards into the unstruck ones behind and buying a few more precious seconds of life. With their last spells used, those least fit for battle beyond the very young and very old, charged at the breach with desperate courage, fighting with whatever they could pick up, including the broken and fallen spears they had no real experience in using. Another gout of flame hit the wall at a gap and the oil-soaked vines ignited. 2 frogman defenders fell backward coated in fire while another segment of wall collapsed, and more lizardmen entered the breach. "How did it come to this?" Hiketi cried and rushed the nearest of the two, the big sword wielder and the only one she saw using a weapon similar to the knight's. He leveled the massive steel blade at her and began to batter at her spear. "Why can't I cut it?" he wondered as he fought the giant frog woman. Her powerful legs kept her able to press him back, and his brother jumped forward, flashing frost pain down at her exposed arm. She jerked her arm back and tried to backhand the lizardman immediately. Zariasu felt the blow, and it rocked him back on his heels until he used his tail to stop himself. The lizardmen were over the walls in several places, and atop the wall he saw the flash of white that could only be his beloved, leading the magic casters inward to aid in the fall. The frogman's spirit began to break in places. Outnumbered, exhausted, and out-equipped, they fled inward, their great hopping strides not half what they'd been before, where they would make their stand. Zariasu was not sure, but Hiketi was proving far more dangerous than he realized. Icy burst. He bellowed out. It was his last use of the skill and he heard the frog woman howl and thrust blind. It was the chance his brother needed. Shaziryu took it, consigning his pain to silence. He thrust his greatsword home at the source of the scream. Zariasu, however, had a moment of horrified realization when he heard more than one spray of blood. The freezing fog faded away to reveal a stark sight. The sword of Shaziryu Sasha had indeed found Hiketi, but he had only severed a hand, while her long spearhead had buried itself in his open mouth and come out the back of his head. 2 chiefs left. Hiketi bellowed at Zariasu as her people fled to make their final stand near the clutch of eggs. She briefly forgot the curious Red Knight, and seeing that Zariasu turned to let his eyes fall on Crush Lulu, she ribbited with joy, yanked her spear back, and hefted it for the throw. Zariasu made the most powerful leap of his life, darting forward and sending frost pain into the body of the queen of the frogmen. Hiketi stood still for a moment, willing her spear to leave her hand, but before it could, Zariasu whispered, "Long live Ainzulgaon." "My turn," Shiltia thought, and faster than Hiketi could have imagined, the Red Knight appeared before the queen and reminded her of the unknown and the danger she represented. The lance came out and pierced the queen's body beside Frostpain, and Hiketi fell with a howl, slowly tumbling backward to land with a crash. The lizardmen roared in triumph and began the rampage. The battle became a massacre, with lizardmen not discriminating between young or old. Their spears found all bodies to be equal. Hiketi struggled to rise, but the lance had her pinned at the belly. All she could do was scream when she saw the lizardmen reach the huts of the wounded frogmen. The screams of the dying wounded were louder than her own, but she redoubled her cries when she saw the lizardmen head for the egg chamber. We surrender. We surrender everything. Mercy. Mercy. The queen yowled as frogmen became an endangered species. Volume 3 Chapter 42. War is ugly. I swear I can smell the blood from here. Ainz thought as the screams reached the high place where he hovered above the fight. Thankfully nobody could see him vomit from on high. He pulled aside his mask and watched the puke fall to blend with blood and gore among the dead, and waited while the lizardmen slowly won their fight. The magic casters were not particularly effective, but as the new world went, he judged them average. Notably they had a surprising number given the relatively small size of their tribes. Still, he kept his eyes on individual duels to the exclusion of all else. Noting the way the two species fought one another, there was no evidence of quarter from either side. Anyone wounded was quickly butchered by the other side. Both saw it as do or die, but little by little it was evident that the lizardmen would triumph. However, the big frog woman, Hecate, he guessed, was quickly capturing his attention. She was utterly stupendous, driving her forces to exceed their limits in a desperate bid for survival, and killing the strongest of the armored lizardmen and the big sword-bearer who seemed to prefer his fists until he faced off against her. When he saw the blue sword-bearer thrust his sword home, it seemed it would be over. Breaches were opened everywhere, and the lizardmen were killing every frogman of every age and state of health they came within killing reach of. Shiltir was then gone from where she had been, and burying her lance in the badly wounded frog woman. Moments later, the big one with the crown of bones upon her head was screaming for mercy and begging to surrender. Thank goodness. I wondered if they would ever stop. Ainz thought, and summoned his screaming demons. The clouds roared overhead and turned black. A high wind picked up that was so clearly unnatural that even in mid-spear thrust, the lizardmen stopped to look and the frogmen in flight ceased to run away. The heads came screaming down from above. The Great One says enough. Frogmen lay down arms, lizardmen take surrenders. The war is over. Any frogmen not on their bellies, will die, any on their bellies, will live. Ainz slowly began to descend among the carnage. The longed-for surrender had come, and Hecate still howled for mercy that in her fevered pain she did not know had been granted. She looked deliriously at the Red Knight. Spare our lives. Spare us and we are yours. Shiltir pointed up to the sky. No, you are his. Ainz finally came into view, descending beside Zariasu, who fell to his knees and grasped his brother's body. Clutching the fallen chief, he howled like Hecate at the loss. Lizardmen whose bloodlust had been curbed by the howling demonic heads Ainz used as messengers, began taking up vines and binding the bodies of frogmen of all ages and states of health. Shiltir, take a scroll out and heal this one, she is in charge, clearly, Ainz said and pointed down at the queen whose crown had now tumbled away from her body and into the bloody mire. Shiltir withdrew both the blue sword and the spirit lance, pulled a scroll of healing from her pocket dimension, and used it on the broken queen. He is your master now, Shiltir said. Surrender to him. She pointed up to Ainz Ulgaun, the master of death, or you will all be wiped out root and branch, and added to his armies as undead. Wails of horror came up from the frogmen ranks that gave out riveting sobs of fear as they realized their final ends. Hecate, her pain and wounds taken away, rolled over to her belly and then up to all fours, as much as she could, and kept her head low to the ground. Queen Hecate of the frogman tribe of All-One, surrenders to King Ainz Ulgaun of the Kingdom of Nazarick, Shiltir said, and Hecate repeated it. Are you the one who defeated the Empire? The one who raised the army of the dead and froze the lake? Mighty Lord? Hecate asked. I am. Ainz answered, not trusting himself enough to say more than 2 words without vomiting again into his mask. Then you are strong, and we submit. Do what you will with us. But let my people live. I beg of you, she said, and fell silent. Had I known what I was facing I would have surrendered immediately. Now look at us, all our work, all my plans. And now we will grind away our days in service to a god of death. Hecate cursed her birth, she cursed her parents, she cursed her vision of a united frogman kingdom, she cursed the war, she cursed her fate and she cursed herself. But she did it all in the quietness of her mind, and said nothing of the sort to the new king of the lake. Lizardmen raised up a cheer that was the counter to her despair. Long live Ainz Ulgaun! Long live Ainz Ulgaun! and he raised his golden staff aloft, calling for silence. The lake now belongs to the lizardman, who will always be part of the kingdom of Nazarick. And what will you do with us? Your slaves? Hecate asked. Ainz stepped away from her for a moment, his mind raced for an answer, such was his desperation for something to say, to a very good question in fact, that he sought to bide time. He removed a wand from his pocket dimension and held it over the body of Shasha, and said, "Raised dead." Before the eyes of disbelieving lizardmen and frogmen alike he proved himself a god that hour, the true master of life and death, as he stumbled over the answer while Shasha began to laugh in his brother's arms. "I have other lakes. I will move you to one of those, and you will live in peace. You will remain queen, unless you dare to rebel. In which case you will cease to be at all. Let's see what you can do if you have no enemies to threaten or unite you. Live or die. It is your choice." Ainz answered her, and the few surviving frogmen's mouths fell open as they were handed a new home. There was another, smaller lake. There can't be many frogmen left alive now. I will send them there. And see what happens next. Ainz thought privately. We are yours forever. Shasha promised, and the united lizardman army knelt as one before the god that granted life to the fallen. Volume 3 Chapter 43 Epilogue. Epilogue. Treating the wounded, tallying the total captive frogmen and egg survivors, and sending the queen and her people through the gate to an unoccupied lake all took several hours. In the end there were fewer than 2,000 frogmen survivors of any age, and most of those were either too young or too old to breed. The lizardman rampage had seen to the breaking of many unhatched frog eggs, leaving only 100 or so that would not be capable of reproducing for at least 15 years. In short, it proved the worst massacre the lake had ever seen. But it was over. The lizardmen had suffered some losses, over 200 dead and another 200 wounded badly enough that only timely intervention kept them from dying. The aftermath of the lizardman celebration had the king of Nazarick formally oversee the union of Shasha and Crush Lulu, thus uniting outright 3 tribes, while the others made a formal decision to settle together into one grand settlement from which only one tribe, the United Lizardmen, would spread from as their numbers grew. All that took hours more, and Ainz parted from them, taking with them the offered gifts of gratitude in the form of their great treasures, which they swore was the only gift fitting to give a god who gave them victory, the lake, and the lives of 2 brave chiefs back before the end of the day. All that meant that it was very dark before Ainz was in his office again, and he only managed to come back when he did by coming up with the impromptu idea of promising to send them someone from his personal retinue to govern and observe them. And now, he was back, alone with Shiltir. They were watching through the mirror as the frogman survivors worked. Hecate proved an intriguing specimen. It was the sole reason she was allowed to survive. "What did you think of the frogmen?" he asked, putting off the punishment a little longer. "Inferior beings, but they were brave. Maybe that will have some value in the future, Master," Shiltir said from beside him. They were making more of their simple huts around one of the lakes of his land, but they lacked the industriousness he was sure they must have possessed before. It was pitiable in a way, despite their intentions. They moved as if they wore lead over their bodies. Slow, heavy, broken. "Do you think they noticed the eggs that were missing?" Ainz asked. "No, my lord, the lizardmen that got into their hatchery or nests or whatever they call them, destroyed many. A few going missing in the aftermath would be completely unnoticed, assumed to be destroyed in the fighting." Shiltir answered with confidence and preened a little, a tiny smile on her face. "Demiurge is very eager to see what he can do with a few raised here on the 6th floor, and Aura is beside herself with excitement." Ainz expanded the view of the mirror outward and scrolled the view to the lizardman village. The lizardmen were hard at work, they had energy that the frogmen did not. Boats were hauling the metal of the knightly armor back toward their homes. A look amidst the village showed that they were already working some of the metal into new useful tools. That is probably more metal than they've ever had to work with before. It should make things far easier for them for quite some time. Ainz commented offhandedly. "I wouldn't know, my lord." Shiltir replied more demurely with an area where she lacked experience. He let her uncertainty pass without comment. The chiefs were in council at the village center. A stone statue was slowly being built in a crude likeness of Ainz himself, as if he were standing amidst the seated circle of leaders. "They're embarking on a golden age, I'm sure of that much. They will prosper under me," Ainz said, more to himself than to Shiltir. But one thought he kept to himself: their brutality and war, breaking eggs, killing the too old and too young. I hadn't expected that. I suppose it was foolish to think a race would act differently than the humans of Earth. But I won't forget it. Discipline will have to be the hallmark of my rule unless I want my kingdom to go down the same old road of humanity back home. It was a sobering thought, more than a little uncomfortable. He sought a distraction immediately. I promised them I would send someone to govern them directly. Would you like to try? Ainz asked the vampire girl. If that is your command. Shaltir bowed her head. I asked if you would like to. Ainz pressed, looking at her more intently. You would have to visit them a few times per month and bring their representatives here occasionally. Do you think you can do that? Shaltir's face brightened. I am confident I can do that much. Then you will go visit both the lizardmen and the frogmen twice per month, pass on my orders, collect any tributes, and oversee them according to my will, Ainz commanded, and then deactivated the mirror. It was done. As you command, my lord, she said, and then her expression became intense as his attention became solely focused on the little guardian. Was I useful, master? She asked with shimmering crimson pools in her eyes, and he stood before her, removing his mask so that his face was exposed to the porcelain doll with a monster soul and a sea of love for him beneath it all. He touched the side of her face and said, My Shaltir, you are more useful than you could possibly know, but you can live with not caring what I am, as long as I am me, is valued so much that I cannot ever say thank you enough. Even if you had done nothing else, that would be enough for me. She sniffled a little. Now clad in her Victorian dress, she would have wiped her nose if she'd had a handkerchief. But I still need punishment. Pretty please. My lord? She said with a sweet and hopeful smile. He cleared his throat. Has Demiurge come back? He was going to take a look at the spear Hiketi used, to find out if there was anything unusual. Yes, my lord. He has He actually wanted to present that to you personally. Shaltir replied. Ainz put on his mask, and nodded. He is outside, isn't he? It was a guess, but Shaltir nodded hastily. Send him in. Ainz shot out with haste, and Shaltir rushed to the door to admit perhaps the greatest genius in Nazarick, clad in his pinstripe suit, his tail lashing at his back. My lord. Your time with the lizard man, it was truly amazing, he said with awe as he went down to bend one knee and hold one hand over his chest while he bowed his head. It seemed worthwhile, Ainz said as offhandedly as he could, waving it away as if it had been trivial. To have found such an intriguing thing, only such as you could have accomplished so much in so little time, Demiurge insisted. Shaltir, my seat, Ainz said. Right away, my lord, she said with a bright smile on her face as she went behind him. He didn't look back, only sat when she said, Ready, my lord. Why does this chair feel strange? He wondered until he looked down to see Shaltir panting from all fours beneath him. This punishment. It is more of a reward. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Lord Ainz. Shaltir breathed out as Demiurge looked on in shock. Only the God Creator, the one who stayed, could think to use a guardian as a seat. Truly impressive, my lord. Ainz could barely think for a moment, but Demiurge went on as if nothing were the matter. He drew the spear out of his pocket dimension and held it horizontally before Ainz and pointed out the little rune on the hilt, and then another on the wooden shaft. The spear, as Shaltir said, had unnatural luck, finding the gap in the armor of the lizardman chief, then finding the other chief in the midst of agony and fog. I had her questioned about it, and she revealed it to be runecraft from the dwarves. The shaft is also crafted with runes for strength, which is why it did not break despite the heavy use. She knew very little about this, but there were a few scattered other pieces of weaker runic equipment among her forces which we have also confiscated. Ainz nodded, trying and failing to ignore the heavily breathing Shaltir. I see, he said. So I propose an investigation into the matter. From what the lizardmen have said, the dwarves trade in this, and are the only ones who can make it. Perhaps if you permitted me, I believe Albedo can handle the integration process for all our conquered lands for quite some time. I would like to personally venture there to find out more. It should help with our concerns over resources if we can find a source of truly cost-free enchanting. Ainz barely registered what was being said, shifting on Shaltir's back. Am I hurting you, Shaltir? He asked, awash with shame that he was letting her think this was her intended punishment. She was shaking her head when Demiurge asked, Shall I go see to it? I'm going. Ainz was about to say, I'm going to get up to Shultier, but he paused when she let out a faint whimper, and Demiurge, believing he had spoken entirely what he intended, jumped to the conclusion he considered most logical. I would be honored to have you go with me, Lord Ainz. Or would it be better said that I am going with you? The crystalline eyes of the demon sparkled as he stared up at his master, his tail lashed about with wild joy. A journey with the last of our creators. I am unworthy of such an honor. The demon cried out in ecstasy. Master. May I rub my thighs together a little? You feel so good like this, Shultier exclaimed. Punish me more. Pereroncino. Why? 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 He cried out in his mind and out of raw desperation to escape the moment he grasped hold of Demiurge's words. Begin planning immediately. I want to be leaving for the Dwarf Kingdom soon and I need to go prepare as well, right now. Yes, right away, not a moment to lose, Ainz said and shot to his feet while doing his best not to look down at the ahegao face he was sure Shultier was wearing. Left alone with Shultier, Demiurge waited until she stood. Lord Ainz. He seems quite different somehow. Was your trip truly all right? I have been so busy I haven't had time to even see him. He did not expect the bliss on Shultier's face to become a mask of wrath when she bared her fangs. Lord Ainz is Lord Ainz. He is perfect no matter what he is, and if you should ever suggest otherwise, or harm him in any way, I will tear off your tail and beat you to death with it. Demiurge took a step back, and realized a moment later how his words might have sounded. No. Of course I don't mean it as a criticism, anything he does is right. Just different from what I thought. It must be me that is wrong, he said, and Shultier's face became sweet and childlike again. Of course, do enjoy your trip, Demiurge, she said, and folding her hands behind her back, she exited the office and skipped all the way back to her quarters, humming happily to herself, ignoring the head-scratching Demiurge who went off to his own quarters to prepare a moment later.